Recording in progress.
Okay. Good morning and welcome. Welcome back to our third lesson in our survey of church history, which is trouble from without persecution. Last week, we introduced the period of earliest Christianity, where we'll be spending 3 lessons and we focused on the first half of that period, the sub-apostolic church. That's the period from about the New Testament to 140. So how do we know about the church in the generation after the apostles? Okay, they had to write it down. Some people wrote some things down. So we have writings from this period, from people who knew apostles, who were disciples, specifically like a pupil of disciples, some of them, who were saints in the church at this time. And so their writings are somewhat similar to the writings of the New Testament because they're written in the same period, from the same culture, and like the New Testament, they are not systematic or comprehensive. But we took the example of the Didache. Who remembers what Didache means?
Teaching the apostles.
Teaching, yes, the word Didache means teaching, and the whole title is the teaching of the apostles. And so this is possibly one of the earliest pieces of sub-apostolic writing that is not in the New Testament. And what is it about? I sent you all home with copies, and online we had access to it. So did y'all read it? And good job. And then what was it about?
Baptism, communion.
Okay, there were some worship practices discussed: baptism, communion, the Eucharist, or communion or Eucharist, and then prayer, fasting.
Yeah, and then one of life, one of death, talked about the kinds of life.
Okay, the choices in life. What did you say, Chris? It was kind of how to be a Christian, right? So it starts out with the 2 ways. Choose the way of life and not the way of death, right? That's one of the things it's about. And then it had some warnings. What were the warnings? They focused on something in particular.
Well, in the beginning was sin.
In the beginning, it was sin, yes, and that's not what I was thinking of, but you're right. It really did warn against the way of death. Yeah, absolutely. What about those later parts?
Well, this was, yeah.
Okay, false prophets. So it counseled the hospitality towards prophets and apostles. So we see that there were still apostles alive and walking around and teaching, right, in this period. And they're teaching, but it warned against false apostles, false prophets, false teaching. And so keep that in mind, because when we get to our third lesson in 2 weeks on this period, the church had a lot of guarding against false teaching that it had to do in this period.
Okay. You're supposed to support the prophets. And all.
Support the prophets, yeah, feed them, house them, but not for too long, because, right?
Don't make them too
comfortable. They shouldn't be there 3 days. 2 is okay, but 3 is not, right? Okay. So, and then it ends with an encouragement to faithfulness. So what surprised you or amused you or struck you about this writing?
Well, like I said before, the baptism part, where they had to do 3 pours.
Okay.
But they didn't immerse. But you said some did.
So we see.
Yeah.
Okay, the instructions for baptism, and Dr. Stanglin talked about this in his when he introduced Didache last week, about how they were to baptize. What's the preferred water? Fresh water, running water, living water. Yes, so that's the preferred water. But if not living water, then fine, just whatever water you have. And if you don't have enough water to immerse in, then you can pour. And they specified 3 times. What are the 3 times?
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Yeah, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And we still baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So there is that thread of continuity with the church. Now, Sandy pointed out that they poured 3 times. Good thing we don't immerse 3 times. But there are ancient traditions of the church. The Eastern Orthodox does immerse 3 times.
Wow.
Yeah, they still do that. An infant, but immersion at 3 times. 3 times, right? And so we have gone to 1. We see there's a difference there, and yet we have that in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. What else? What else struck you?
In the Lord's Prayer, they do it, let's see, 3 times a day.
Okay, it's specified to say the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day. So I know that I myself have wondered, did they really, was this just a model prayer? Did they really recite it as like by rote? Did they memorize it and recite it the way the church did in following years? And we see here very early in Didache, they did recite it and 3 times a day. Chris?
I was going to say on the Eucharist, they had the cup first and then the bread.
They had the cup first and then the bread. So we have this very early testimony to their practice of communion, and it was cup first, which we normally do the bread first. And that is because of, we do the bread first because of the way it is spelled out in some of the institution narratives. And yet even in those institution narratives, like in Luke, there's a cup and then a bread and then a cup. And so we see that, there's this element of their choice of how to do that. What else? One more thing that was striking to me about the Eucharist, I wonder if any of you.
In order to take of it.
You had to be baptized. It was for baptized believers. Now, they didn't say baptized believers, but not any Methodists, right? Not any Lutherans, because they didn't have that. That was not yet in existence, right? There is one church in this period. It is a unified church with quite a bit of diversity in the church, which we even see in the New Testament as well. But you needed to be a believer to participate in the Lord's Supper. He needed to be my Lord for me to participate in my Lord's Supper. Go ahead.
When we were in Laurel this last time, we went to the Episcopal Church, and the lady behind me, when we got ready for communion, she said, if you're a baptized believer, you're welcome to take communion.
Yeah, so the practice of communion is usually defined as open or closed. And the modern definitions of open or closed is a closed communion is something that like the Roman Catholic Church does, where you must be a baptized believer in the Roman Catholic Church, because that's really the only church they recognize, to participate in their communion. But many churches, the Episcopal Church being one, we have always done this. If you are any kind of baptized believer, then the communion is open, therefore you would come and you would partake, all of us together. And that universality of the church is something that is attested early, and that Dr. Stanley talked about last week. Linda, you had a comment? Oh, no.
I was just remembering Bill went to a Catholic church with his trips to Chicago. One Sunday he decided to go to the Catholic church, and when they all walked down to get communion, he didn't exactly know what to do, and the priest was telling him what to do and frowning at him. Because it was very clear Bill didn't know what he was doing by their traditions.
Right. Well, in a Catholic church, you are not supposed to go and participate in communion, but you can go forward and you cross your arms to receive a blessing. So that is a tip for any of you who visit a Catholic service. Okay, comments or questions from our people online? I want to make space for you to jump in here. Okay, you don't have to. All right, well, we have our video today on this period, and we mentioned persecution, and that is going to be the focus of our video. So if you are watching a recording of this class after the fact, then this is the time to pause and go to the Center for Christian Studies website, log in with our account, and watch video module 3. Okay, What did you think of this overview of the persecution of the church in this period?
Very
Very what?
enlightening.
Enlightening. Some pieces of it were painted a very vivid picture, didn't it? Yeah, and then over here.
I was just gonna say, it must have been very, very harsh.
Very harsh. Yes, he talked about some of the cruelest tortures ever conceived were employed against Christians during this period. Now, so there are 2 suggested further readings for this class, and I found that one of them is the letters between Pliny the Younger and Emperor Trajan, and the link is in the handout. You can go online and find that link, or you can type it in. But Dr. Sanglin quoted most of it. He really, we really got the gist of that. And so I didn't copy it for you because, these extra readings are, sometimes they're hard to get to. So I just chose the other one. And it is the letter of Ignatius to the Romans. Now, when he introduced Ignatius, remember he had 7 letters that he wrote to different people while he was on the way to what? Anyone remember? To be martyred. So he was headed to Rome for trial and presumably for him execution. And he was in fact executed. He died in 110. And so he is writing to the church in Rome while he's on his way to Rome to be executed. So, thinking about the cruelty of the treatment of this persecuted class, I want you to pay attention when you read Ignatius to the Romans. What did he think was going to happen to him? What is his expectation of his execution what is it going to be? So pay attention to that when you get there. Okay, what else was notable on this video?
I think it was interesting. They gave them 3 chances. They would ask them 3 times if they denounced Christ.
Okay, Pliny talked about asking 3 times, and then we also under Decius. So this is the I know the online people won't be able to see this very well, but in this 3rd section, this later section, getting up from 200 to 300, or even 250 to 300, is when we get an empire-wide persecution. Before then, it's localized. It's little pop-up instances. But by 250, there's a campaign to convince Christians to deny Jesus. Like, that is the goal. It's to turn them around and make them good Roman citizens who are willing to deny Jesus and worship Caesar.
So is the gist of most of this that they wanted you to worship the emperor, not Jesus, that they saw Jesus as a threatening thing?
They did see the idea that there's another king besides Caesar as threatening and treasonous. But they also saw Christian behavior as dangerous and subverting the fabric of society. Let's read in order to address that question, which is very good, let's read 1 Peter 2, 9 through 12, if someone could read that. And then someone else look up 1 Peter. Oh, I wrote 2 Peter, but it's 1 Peter, isn't it? 4, 1 through 4. I'll check while someone reads 1 Peter 2, 9 through 12.
If you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who calls you out of the darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you, as aliens and strangers in the world, to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that, though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us.
Thank you. And someone else, 1 Peter 4, 1 through 4.
Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and the detestable idolatry. They are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless wild living, and they even use on you.
Thank you. Okay, so, we saw that he's saying you have a new identity. You aren't who you used to be. Don't do the things you used to be as pagans. And what do you hear in that might be alarming to the pagans or make them suspicious of those Christians? What kind of?
He's calling them a nation.
Okay.
Sounds like, okay, it's them versus us, and they're getting bigger and bigger.
Okay, so there's two things in there. Is it them versus us, right? Christians were when he talked about the brother and sister, and how they were sometimes accused of incest, Dr. Sangland said they formed a new family so well that it confused the pagans around them. So what we have is these very strong bonds between people who should not have very strong bonds. Sometimes some are nobles and some are slaves, and they're associating with each other as if social station has no meaning. Well, that is threatening to a society built on social classes. Yes.
And they had to have someone as a leader for all of that.
They had leaders who were not, maybe the leaders who would be chosen under pagan societal values, right? Maybe somebody who's of low station is a leader.
Or even one, like Jesus.
Right, and the idea of Jesus as king was something that they preached and they talked about, and there's another king besides Caesar, right? That's very threatening, okay?
It would also be threatening when the Christians say, and he's coming, he's dead, but he's coming back.
He's coming back, and they expected that, and we know from some of the writings that they expected that to be very soon, and we still have that understanding of Jesus' return can be any time. And so we live in the belief that either the time to Jesus is short or our own time is short. And so our allegiance is to God and not to man. And they wanted allegiance to man. They wanted allegiance to their, Caesar as God, but also their cities. Think about their cities. In an ancient pagan society, how do you ensure that your city has good crops, good trade results, good fertility for your people? How do you get that?
They all have to work together.
You work together
And
to,
you pray to that God.
you pray to the God of the city. So when these Christians are not attending the festivals, which the festivals had debauched behaviors, and so that's one reason they wouldn't go, and the other reason is because they're always dedicated to the gods. Nothing is neutral. All these things are dedicated to gods. Olympic contests, dedicated to the gods. Everything that you do is couched in those terms, and when Christians don't participate, well, what about, we're supposed to be working together to protect our city, to seek Athena's blessing, to seek, any local god or goddess. If you're not participating, it's to the community's detriment. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Questions or comments from our online people? Okay, Chris.
Something that Dr. Stamos mentioned, that one that either was reading, sometimes there were women leaders.
Threatening.
threatened.
Okay, so Dr. Stamen mentioned that in relation to the Bacchae, which when I first watched this video, I couldn't understand the word he was saying. So, I wrote it on the board just so in case you wanted to know what he was saying. Bacchae, the Bacchae. And it was threatening that they had women. Well, look at the New Testament. There are prophetesses, right? There are women who are mentioned as fellow workers in the kingdom, as deaconesses, deacon in the feminine, prophet in the feminine. And so what are they doing in society? And we see over and over in Acts, and a number of prominent Greek women believed. That happens multiple times in Acts. And so it is threatening to their society. Yeah. Other questions or comments on the view that, the difference in views that people would have had of Christians compared to how Christians viewed themselves? They didn't think they were atheists, right? But if you aren't participating with the panoply of gods, then you're not religious in the way that society wants you to be religious. Yeah. Well, did you catch in the very last, he gave the 10 persecutions that Augustine gave. So these 4, and then Augustine was saying, well, how silly, there were so much more than 10. So these 4 are not comprehensive. These are just some little pictures of how it would have been in this. So there would have been many more persecutions than these 4. But in the very last one, he said that Diocletian needed to do something. Why? To do what? Unify the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire began to decline around 180. I've got that on your timeline in your handout. And they had increasing problems in this period with border wars, with revolts in outlying provinces, with financial and administrative problems. And one major milestone that you will often see on secular timelines is the division of the Roman Empire into East and West under Diocletian in 286. So he divided the empire to try to stabilize it, but it didn't get any more stable. And so he thought, you know what we need? We need a common enemy. Who's going to be our common enemy? Christians, right? And so this was an effort to use the worship of the Roman gods to unify people, and to use a common enemy of Christians who wouldn't worship the Roman gods to unify people. And the Christians wouldn't fall in line with worshiping the Roman gods, and so it made it a perfect combination. And he also mentioned what was the state of the spread of Christianity at that point under Diocletian.
There were about 1,000 martyrs.
About 1,000 martyrs, or none in the thousands, he said, over this whole period. But what about the spread of Christianity?
It went all the way to Asia.
It had spread. It had gone to Asia Minor is the way that the scripture talks about that area around like Turkey, but Persia, yeah, it had even gone to Persia. Also, it was spreading faster and faster.
The more they were,
The more we are mown down, the more we grow, is what that historian quote gave us. And the blood of martyrs has seed. And so persecution served to, he talked about how it engendered some sympathy, but it also unified the Christians within themselves, and other people seeing that unity, that family, those connections that they had that would have been impossible in the social boundaries of the pagan system, the way that they were faithful under duress. That was an incredible witness for the church. And Christianity is just, the spread is just growing and growing and growing here. And that was alarming to Diocletian and his successors. But the tide turns after 311. And when we get past this period, we'll talk about what happens next. So keep that in mind, that persecution reaches its height in that 303 kind of and following period. And but the spread of Christianity is reaching a height there as well. Okay. So Christians under this period, they believe their response to being asked to deny Christ really mattered. Do you think we would be tempted to say, well, it's just words. What does it matter? The words. What did they think about that?
Not true.
Not true? It was worth it to many.
Let your conversation be honest.
But they did, the people that had the deceitful form, they let them back in once.
with some penitence. They had, they had their forged documents saying that they were not Christians. Yeah, but they didn't really do it. Yeah, that picture that he painted of how your family was in the room and they stayed strong and were tortured and killed, and this other family goes like, sure, but we volunteer to curse Christ, and can we let them back in? And this idea of how confession is central to Christianity really comes out, doesn't it? Okay, we're out of time. So any other questions or comments on this lesson?
Well, in 1 Peter 2:12, it says, have your conversations honest among the Gentiles.
Honest among the Gentiles, yeah. There's a sense of their integrity, right? And how that integrity should suffuse all things, their business dealings, their everyday practices, but especially in confession of Jesus Christ.
Well, number 2, Trajan, that said Christians were not liked. I didn't get that one.
Sought out. Christians were not sought out. Yeah, they didn't hunt them down as they did in some of the later persecutions. This earlier was sort of he said it, he made a little joke about don't ask, don't tell, but yeah.
This puts a new light on reading First Peter.
Yes.
Because you're seeing exactly what he's saying to them. I keep questioning where would I have been if I lived in this time? It certainly causes me to search deep for myself.
It does, and this, he develops this idea of their constant marginalization, and I don't think we in our current society are persecuted. Christianity is still the default way of thinking in most of our society. I don't want to minimize the persecution that really does go on in other parts of the world. There are martyrs, there are Christian martyrs today in other parts of the world. So we wouldn't want to minimize that by acting as if we're persecuted, but we have all experienced that little tinge of social marginalization at one time or another, for not participating in debauchery or for espousing a Christian belief that is not thought to be logical or reasonable. And so we can think ourselves, we're not just completely separated from the early Christians and their experience. We have, even though it's only a little bit, and then there are communities in other parts of the world that we can support that experience violent persecution.
We had a visitor here on Wednesday night who was attending a conference and came on Wednesday night. He's from China. And I talked to him about his persecution. And they're socially marginalized Christians in China, and they're experiencing some of these same attitudes that the early Christians did. I often think about him and how they're even having to worship in secret and leave the residence one at a time and space out their departures and arrivals so that they won't be singled out and identified. It's so things like this social marginalization, especially, are happening now.
Yes. Well, and when Daniel came and spoke, gosh, I think it's been more than a year now, but he talked about in the refugee communities coming out of Persian countries, how people would be beaten and killed for Christian beliefs, and some of them fled their countries because they were suspected of being open towards Christianity and or some other thing, treatment of women, or there are other reasons that they fled. But so supporting the Napiers in their ministry is supporting Christians who are being actively, violently persecuted, and of course there's others.
So when was First Peter written? I'm trying to narrow that down. It's like between.
So it would have.
50?
I should have looked up the date, but it would have been probably late 50s.
Well,
What
it
did,
says AD 62 to 64, possibly from Rome. They read it.
possibly, so, okay, so I think that's a more common understanding, is that, so we have this
You
on
think
March
it's earlier.
60, no, I don't.
Oh, okay.
No, I don't. I just didn't remember.
Okay.
Okay. Peter was probably martyred in Rome under Nero in these years 64 to 68. Somewhere in there is probably when Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome. And so it may be that Peter's letters were written from Rome to them. So it may be all the way up to the early 60s.
So he must have had someone to be able to get his letters out to those churches that he was writing to, because
Yes, well,
you would think if he is in prison, and I'm guessing, and he's writing, who's getting his letters out for him?
well,
He
even
didn't
you remember
deliver them.
Paul
They
wrote
didn't have
from
to write
prison.
them
Paul was writing from prison in Rome and under house arrest and preaching to the guard.
out.
And he talked about some of that. And so Paul, we have this a house arrest situation is a little different maybe
Right.
than what everyone experienced. And yet we see that there's that idea that yes, they were allowed to get their letters out. Yeah. And Ignatius seems to have been allowed to send his letters out even over the time that he's being transferred under guard. He's a prisoner to Rome to be martyred.
So apparently their letters were not read. Coming and going,
I don't-
there reads them.
I don't know that. That's interesting.
Or maybe
There
the
may
version- or
it may be that there's
version-
information on that I just don't know, or it may be that we don't have information. I don't know.
Well, and he preached to the guard. There were people there that listened and helped. that
Maybe,
word out.
yeah, maybe, who were sympathetic to him,
Yeah,
possibly.
all kinds of scenarios that could happen.
Well, thank you, everyone. If you missed any of your blanks that you want, mine is filled out here, and also I have added filled out versions online so that you could always go look at the complete versions if you want. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deanna, for another great lesson. Do we have announcements? Any other announcements?